you were hiring people for an important job, what criteria would you set with proper qualifications? Skills, experience, people that are productive, people that can work well with others, an employee who was loyal and honest. All of those would seem to fit the description of what we wanted. You might also consider what you don't want. One time on a TV show, a guy interviewed somebody and he told the boy after the interview, he said, bring me the exact opposite of that, right? You know, that is, right? That's not what you want. You ever considered the hiring criteria for Jesus' apostles? Think about it for just a second. The hiring criteria for any job that ever gets posted, for any job that's ever looking to hire, you can almost assure that there's some kind of requirement. Have you considered the hiring requirement for Jesus' apostles? If you go along with the scripture that we read there just a few moments ago, there doesn't appear, there doesn't appear to be much in the way of hiring criteria. I want you to turn in your Bibles real quick to Mark chapter 3. This is what Josh read just a moment ago. And I want to look at a couple of things here just real quick. In Mark chapter 3. Mark chapter 3 in verse 13, it says, and he went up on the mountain and he called to him those he himself. But there's really not anything there, right? It says he hired, but he didn't say hired, but he went up to the mountain and he called to him those he wanted. That's about it. So let's think about then, because we're about halfway through, or maybe a little farther through on these lessons where we've been talking about apostles. Let's think in this group. Well, first of all, there were several fishermen, right? And so perhaps you might look at fishermen and say, okay, they're a sturdy lot. They're strong. They're capable of travel. They've probably got some connections with various people. Maybe that makes sense. We don't read that. That's just me guessing. But there were a few fishermen. Okay. There was a tax collector. That's who we're going to talk about tonight. And you might say, okay, well, that makes a little sense. Maybe understands money a little bit, right? Maybe that would be okay. Well, they have a pretty bad reputation in the community. We'll talk about that here in just a few moments. But you say, okay, well, here's the tax collector. He knew money. Who was in charge of the purse of the 12 apostles? Not the one that was dealing with the money, right? We later find out that Judas was a thief. And you might say, well, that seems odd. The person who knows everything is choosing people to work for him. And A, he's putting them in the wrong spot. And B, he's putting the wrong people. We're thinking about it our way, right? We're thinking about this and we're saying, I would never have done it that way. How many times have you read something in the Bible and thought, I don't know if I'd have done it that way? Probably quite a bit. We read in the Bible that God's ways are not our ways, but sometimes that gets stretched to the limit just a little bit, right? Jesus chose who he chose, and quite often we don't have any answer as to the why. Maybe one of the bigger whys is the person we're going to talk about this evening, and that's Matthew. We're going to look at this the same way we've looked at all of these apostles. We're going to look at a few things about them. But we're going to start and finish, sort of wrap around this character Matthew. To start with, as you can see on the screen there, a tax collector as an apostle. A tax collector, often referred to in the scriptures as a publican, but it's the same thing. Matthew collected taxes for Rome. Now, Matthew's not Roman, but he works for Rome. And he collected tax from his fellow Jews in Capernaum. A lot of the early scriptural things that Jesus involved in was in and around the city of Capernaum on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. But he collected taxes from his own people. Now, this was something that was a bit of a conflict for others. A lot of times people viewed these tax collectors as a political traitor, as it were. Somebody who seems to be working for the enemy. The Jewish people there in Israel did not necessarily look kindly on Rome. Rome sort of dictated what they had to do. And so Matthew, as a Jew, working for the Romans, taking money from his own people, a lot of people didn't like that. We'll go a little further with that as we go on as well. His profession is sort of a symbol of the Roman occupation. Throughout history, you'll see people that have, the word is often used as collaborated, who have worked with people that occupied the country. You can read in books about World War II how a lot of French citizens collaborated with the Germans and how the people didn't really like that. And those people had a negative name even after the war was over. He seems like that to some people as well. To make matters worse, tax collectors made their money in a kind of boss up the line expects me to give how much money? 100. There's an imbalance here. The 10 extra dollars that Ben gave can go right here. Now, this is sort of an secret. And Ben, in our situation here, is probably not going to think too highly of me. But if he causes much of a problem, I can tell my Roman bosses and life can become even more difficult. Maybe it's easier for the extra 10 out there. This is corruption at sort of its highest point. But it was sanctioned corruption, and Matthew, as a tax collector, would have been involved in it. As a result, you can imagine that they would have been considered the worst sinners. We'll get to that in a few minutes as well. So maybe it's a big deal that Jesus asks Matthew to be one of his apostles. I think in many ways, this sort of paints a picture of what Jesus was doing. Because how many of you, when interviewing somebody for a position, would say, "Are you going to steal?" And they say yes, and you say, "All right." Probably not going to do that, right? That's not the way we would handle it. But Matthew seems to check all the negative boxes on the hiring criteria. Let's talk a little bit about Matthew here this evening. First of all, I would argue he's one of the better known apostles, at least by name, but we actually don't know much about it. He's mentioned 7 times in the Bible, one less than Thomas, if you remember correctly. But he's one of the few apostles that we actually get the calling of him recorded. We're going to look at all 3 of those, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in the Gospels this evening. I want you to turn in your Bible to the book of Matthew, Matthew chapter 9, to start with. Matthew 9 and verse 9, and then we'll look at Mark's version and Luke's version as well. There's no version in John of any of these. But Matthew 9 and verse 9, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office. And he said to him, "Follow me." And it says that he arose and followed him. So you just think about that for a second. Jesus is passing through. He sees a man sitting at the tax office, the place that we probably would have walked to the other side to avoid. Jesus sees this man and he says, "Follow me." You might say, "Well, that's the book of Matthew, so they might have made that one look a little better." That's fine. Let's go to Mark chapter 2 and verse 14. Mark's the oldest of the 4 Gospels. We'll see what he had to say about it. Mark 2 and verse 14. As he, Jesus, passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax office. And he said to him, "Follow me." So he arose and followed him. Okay, well, that's almost word for word the same story, but there is something noticeably different in the book of Matthew versus the book of Mark. The book of Matthew said he saw Matthew. The book of Mark Said he's called Levi. All right. Well, then let's go to Luke. All right. 2 out of 3, right? Whichever one gets it right is the one we'll go with here. Luke chapter 5, verse 27 and 28. After these things, he, Jesus, went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax office. And he said to follow me. Verse 28. So he, lowercase h, Matthew, Levi, whoever, left all, rose up, and followed him. The story is almost the exact same in all 3 versions. There's a slight name difference we'll get to. But I think the Luke version tells more than anything else. Because the Luke version gives you the second verse that says he left all and followed him. Now, I dare say that Matthew may have left as much as anybody by following Jesus. Because Matthew had an almost sanctioned, guaranteed job that put money in his pocket and a little bit of extra money. Remember when we talked about Peter and Andrew and the fishermen, and they went out and they fished, and they said they didn't catch anything all night. What happens as a fisherman when you do that for a living and you catch nothing all night? What happens to the wallet? Pretty empty, right? But if you go to Ben and collect $10 extra and 10 extra from Melvina and 10 extra from Sue Ann, that's easy money. So when it says he left all, yeah, he left sin, but he also left a job that was making a lot of money for him. Doesn't tell us much, though, beyond his job. You might have noticed that Mark and Luke call him Levi. Mark actually says Levi, the son of Alphaeus. These are parallel passages, and Levi's never mentioned again. So I think it's safe to assume it's the same person in each of these. From what I've read, from what I've studied, most likely Levi is a reference to the tribe that he was from. 12 tribes of Israel, the Levites were the priestly tribe. And that's most likely from what I've seen. It also could be that this is a Saul-Paul kind of thing where a name change from one to another. The problem is we don't get a great story beyond just the 7 names that are mentioned. He was a Jewish man employed by Rome, so it makes sense that that might have been the case. But I was more interested in the son of Alphaeus, because the little song that we learned when we sang the apostle song growing up, it mentions James, the son of Alphaeus, down at the end. And I don't know, I'll give you a minute. Think about all the Alphaeuses that you know in your life. We'll take a minute to sit here and relax while you do it. But all the Alphaeuses that you know probably could fit on a pretty small poster, right? Post-it note. You don't know a whole lot of them. And it's like, wait a minute. One of the apostles is called James, the son of Alphaeus, and this one is called Levi. Where's your mind going right now? Maybe brothers, right? We've seen a little bit of brothers right here. However, I hate to disappoint you, but most scholars have said that there is no connection, that the name Alphaeus was a fairly common name of people there at the time. We thought we'd crack the code on something. Now we're back to square one on who this person is. But these names, Matthew, Levi, we're talking about the same person right here. When we talk about God's ways not being our ways, this is a good example. Let's make all the names the same all the way through. Would have been my only suggestion right there. Well, where else do we see the word or the name Matthew? Well, most of you probably know that the first book in the New Testament is entitled Matthew, right? I would imagine that we could probably ask most anybody that we came up with and said, name me books of the Bible. And I would say more people would get Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John right than any others. It would get a little hairy in the middle. We might catch Revelation on the back end. So the question that we'll ask them, did Matthew write the Gospel of Matthew? Well, we've talked about fact and legend. We've talked about truth and tradition in here with these apostles. And if you have ever read it closely, you'll notice that none of the Gospels ever names the author. Now, you might say, whoa, wait a minute. Let's go to Matthew chapter 1. Real big old tall writing right at the top of Matthew chapter 1. It says the Gospel according to Matthew. It sure does. But nowhere in the next 28 chapters does it say that Matthew wrote it. Neither does it say that Mark or Luke. John, we talked about this the other night, it was written by the apostle who Jesus loved. And if I could say my ways are not the same way, I would say, listen, can I get a definitive name on that real quick, right? We go back to hiring for just a second. If we say, let's hire the guy that I like. What's his name? You know, the guy I like. Can we get a name a little bit clearer? It's a little tough sometimes. Matthew, the apostle, though, is traditionally considered the author of the book. Most experts believe it was written sometime between about 60 and 80 AD. It's after the book of Mark, but that's a 20-year gap. So that's kind of a longer period. Might have even been a little bit later than that. But it was likely written in Hebrew or Aramaic, which would have been common languages there at the time. But as we see in this lesson, Matthew doesn't really play a big role in any of the Gospels. But that, of course, doesn't mean that he didn't write the book. And here's the part that it seems to me that makes me think that it was Matthew, is because, and I will firmly say that I am not the scholar that a lot of people are on this, but there has never been put forth a viable alternative to Matthew being the author. And so if we say that Matthew is the author, we stand a pretty good chance of being right. There are some other books that may have some viable alternatives as to who the author was. But the Gospel of Matthew is most likely written. But I'll say, I don't totally know that answer. Speaking of things we don't know. Try to do this with every one of the apostles. How did Matthew die? Most of the time, the information I found fills up about a full page here. This one takes about 3 sentences. We won't be here long. I had to pad it a little bit up here just to make it work, right? But there's a lot of disagreement on how he died. Some say he was beheaded. Some say stoned. Some say burned. I even saw something that said he was stabbed. One suggested that he died of old age. What that means to me is we don't have any idea. We're just guessing. Those are all the possible ways to die, I guess, that they could have come up with. But it seems safe that he would have been killed in some point. He was likely martyred in some point, that his death as a gospel preacher. But I do think this would have been an interesting thought. I don't know what the enemies list for people like Peter and Andrew and James and John would have looked like. But what do you think the community reaction to Matthew being made an apostle would have been? Probably a little critical, right? There's probably a lot of people that didn't like him. There's probably a lot of people that said, I wouldn't pick him. We're going to see that here in just a second. So when we say, how did he die? His list of people that didn't like him might have been a little longer. Now, that's all speculation, but I'm just saying, he didn't exactly come into this as the most loved person in the community. But I wanted to circle back to the starting point for what we're going to finish our lesson with this evening. By almost all accounts, Matthew would have been a sinner. And I understand what you're saying. They're all sinners. We all are. I get that. But Matthew's job almost made him such. Would have almost made him a sinner. I want us to think for a second, look for a second at the whole story of Jesus calling Matthew. Let's go back to the book of Matthew, chapter 9. We read a few moments ago, Matthew 9 and verse 9, where it said, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, follow me. And so he arose and followed him. I want to look at the next 4 verses, though, real quick. Matthew 9, 10 through 13. Now it happened, remember, Matthew followed Jesus out of there. Now it happened, as Jesus sat at the table in the house, that behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. So Jesus and his followers are traveling. Matthew is brought on. We only read that he was the one that was asked, but it appears that other tax collectors and sinners, and you can fill in the blank because that seems like it could be anybody, all jumped in as well. Wonder where they're going. All right, verse 11. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Valid question, right? Seems like he's choosing the riffraff to hang out with. Verse 12. When Jesus heard that, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Jesus, if we were him, probably would have only hung out with the greatest and best of people, right? But we don't see Jesus really do that at all, right? He goes to Matthew here and he said, come with me. And Matthew, either by choice or by people desiring or wanting to know a little bit more, they loaded up and come as well. And the Pharisees, the religious people, the religious leaders, immediately question what Jesus has done right here. Many tax collectors and sinners. Pharisees are bothered by this. This is not the first. It won't be the last time we see the Pharisees being bothered by this. They were always trying to trap Jesus, right? Always trying to make Jesus out to be this sort of fraud in the community. Hanging around, eating, chatting it up with the worst people in the community. F-R-A-U-D. That's fraud-like behavior if there ever was any, right? It's fair to say that the Pharisees thought that this was a reflection of the character of Jesus. That's right. They were right, but not the way they thought they were. See, Jesus wasn't eating with the tax collectors and the sinners because he was a sinner too. He was eating with them to demonstrate the mercy of God. He was working to mend this brokenness that comes from being an outsider, right? He's trying to fix this reputation that these people have. He said that the people, he said, it didn't come, that the sick, the well don't need a doctor, right? The sick are who need a doctor. He said, you go and learn from this. That's a pretty strong statement from Jesus. He said, you go and learn from this. I'm showing mercy. I don't need sacrifice. Why did Jesus say that? What does Jesus say in verse 13? That go and learn that I desire mercy and not sacrifice. The old sacrifice, the old method of sacrifice that everybody gave. Look what I'm sacrificing. Look what I'm doing. The man who brought in all the money. Look how much I'm giving. Not what he needed. A physician, but those who are sick. Jesus came to save sinners. John 3 and verse 17 says God didn't send his son into the world to do what? He didn't send him to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. See, here's the thing. Had Jesus made his requirements for who could be an apostle? No. Who would have qualified? Nobody would have qualified. Because the religious people were the Pharisees and they didn't like what he was doing. There was none righteous, no, not one. We read that, right? There were fishermen who lived a rough and tumble life. There were future traders that I'm sure Jesus already knew was coming. And there were tax collectors who were skimming money off the top. Sinners, sinners, sinners. Mercy was what was needed. Tradition, culture, opinion says Matthew shouldn't have been an apostle. The last 2,000 years, tradition, culture, and the opinion of people who wear the name Christian have kept many potential Christians away from Christ. Our decision to say yes, no, before we ever even open the door. What did Jesus ask Matthew? All three verses, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, said two words: follow me. He didn't ask about his background. He didn't ask about his qualifications. He at no point goes in there and says, I realize, and you know it too, that you've done this, and this wrong. If you'll hang out with me for a couple of months, we'll try it and figure out. You might be able to. Didn't do that, right? Follow me. What'd he do? Followed him, right? He went with him. By including Matthew as one of his apostles, Jesus showed that no one would be excluded from a seat at the table. We exclude ourselves. The invitation is there. Matthew could have very well said no. Matthew might have been saying no. He might have been trying it out himself. We'll never know. But Josh read a few minutes ago the list of the apostles. I hope you saw his name in there. We can't, but we read that our name can appear in the book of life. But only if our response to being told to follow me is to get up from what we're doing and go do it. If there's anything we can do for you, anything at all, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.
There was